What is more terrifying? The inexplicable violence of nature or the calculated cruelty of man? Sometimes history leaves us with puzzles that seem to defy the laws of reality. Events that are so bizarre that they spawn decades of obsession and fear. Over time, the horror isn't a mystery at all, but a deliberate hidden chapter of human suffering that was meant to be buried forever. Today, we're venturing behind the Iron Curtain to explore two of the most chilling stories of the 20th century. First, we will trek into the Ural Mountains to re-examine the Dyatlov Pass incident. It's a legend of 9 experienced hikers who trekked into the Siberian wilderness, only to be found dead under impossible circumstances. Then, we will descend into the darkness of the Cold War to uncover the Pitesti prison experiment in Romania. This wasn't just a prison. More than just a prison, it was a laboratory for the psychological destruction of the human soul. One is a riddle of the wild, the other, a nightmare of the state. So, let's turn down the lights and peel back the layers of these true, terrifying mysteries. This is one of those stories that I really kind of had trouble figuring out just where on the spectrum it would fall. A dark history kind of story, a strange things kind of story. Either one of them could easily apply here, so I'm going to do my best to bring you all the best of both sides of it. This is one of those really interesting snapshots of history that's always kind of captured my imagination because there were so many unknowns and bizarre pieces of the puzzle that it took more than 50 years to start figuring out just where they belonged, what they meant. Sadly, for the fairly recent discoveries and breakthroughs, there are always going to be aspects of this story that will always be in the realm of conjecture, speculation, and debate. That being said, let's go back in time to 1959 and have a look at the Dyatlov Pass incident. Chapter 1, From Vijay to Kolatshyakal. It's 1959 in the Soviet Union, and the citizens of Russia, particularly, were still trying to mend the wounds and shake off the effects of World War II that still lingered. 9 young but experienced hikers set off into the wilderness looking for adventure and wanting to test their mettle against the Siberian wilds, seeking some of the most legendary views and ancient beauty of one of the most primal landscapes on planet Earth. On January 27th of 1959, Igor Dyatlov, the 21-year-old engineering student and leader of the expedition, and 8 other hikers set out from the village of Vijay. This was the last village before the party would enter the vast frontier of Siberia. Their goal was to hike the famous and beautiful Ural Mountains. But instead, they found themselves on the slopes of Kolatshyakal, or the Mountain of Death. Dyatlov was a very experienced hiker, as were most of the people accompanying him on his trek. We have diaries that survived that fateful journey into the untamed. They paint a picture of their week traveling, skiing across frozen rivers, venturing deeper into an ever-darkening forest. The only refuge from the unrelenting Siberian night were the modest campfires around which they huddled and shared songs, drinks, and meals. They also took many photos as they conquered the wilds, capturing moments in time that are now uncanny ghostly echoes. People from another time just trying to tell their story. These photographs are made more haunting when you look at Zenaida Komarova, or Zena to her friends, looking at the camera and smiling despite the frostbite. Or when we think about Lyudmila Dubanina, the youngest member of the group, sitting next to a campfire and eagerly scribbling away in her diary about all the things they had seen. After just one night in the wilderness, it became clear that one of the group, Yuri Yudin, was not doing well. He was lagging behind, limping along, as his body was plagued by rheumatism. Yuri would make a decision that would ultimately save his life. You see, I know that I said there were 9 hikers, but there were only 9 that lost their lives. Yuri Yudin was the 10th hiker, and the only one to survive due to his fateful decision after that first night. This was one of the times when Zina wrote 8 short words about Yuri's departure. Yuri is leaving us today. It is sad. No one thought it at that time, but this would be a literal final goodbye written in Zina's own hand. With much melancholy hovering over Yuri and the 9 remaining hikers, Yuri began his lonely trek back to Vijay. Despite the untimely parting of ways with Yuri, Dyatlov and his friends continued their hike into the Ural Mountains. After Yuri is no longer with them, our only link to the 9 are through the vague trails they left behind. Their diaries and photographs that were retrieved. And it's from this point on that the creeping air of inevitability and looming tragedy really begins to take root. They continue skiing more and more into the shadows of Kolatsyakl. The mountain itself would have been looming over the group, a silent harbinger. At this point, the diaries of the group are fairly uneventful, remarkable only in how just unremarkable they are. There didn't seem to be any kind of sense of impending dread in the group. We can see them in the photos gathering around a fire, raising drinks, and looking truly happy in these moments. It's so very easy to imagine them buzzing in conversation, singing songs together, and celebrating their life and reveling in the spirit of adventure. Despite the air of foreboding that you and I experience as we're reliving these events, because we know how the story ends, the group seemed to be acting like it was just another camping trip. However, their fate was already in the slow spiral of being sealed, and that harbinger I mentioned was already beginning to play its games with the young men and women. As they pushed deeper into the wilds, the weather was already beginning to turn. Raging winds blew down blinding waves of snow from the peaks of the timeless mountains. Chapter 2, The Last Camp, February 1st, 1959. The morning of February 1st was bleak and cold. Despite being battered by bad weather for the last couple of days, the party gathered their things and continued on. However, in the bad weather, they had actually overshot their intended route, and they now found themselves on the treacherous slopes of Kolatsyakl. Now this is where we definitely have to enter the muddy realm of speculation. You see, by the time the group had realized their error, it was far too late in the day to backtrack. Now the group faced a choice. They could retreat into the relative safety and shelter of the woods, or they could set up camp right there on the exposed and far more dangerous slopes. Now, the choice they made was to remain on the slope. The conditions there would have been unforgiving and even brutal at times. The reason for them choosing to remain on the slope is where we hit that point of only having conjecture and speculation to go on. Some theorize that Dyatlov, who loved challenging himself and his companions, had them set up there. Perhaps to have them prove that they could survive in that dangerous and uneven terrain, with nature battering them from all sides during the frigid night. Others speculate that it was possible they were just too exhausted to trek that far, and instead opted to set up right where they were. Regardless as to the why they made such a fateful, if reckless choice, we know they did. That night, they would have huddled down in their tents, writing in their diaries about the events of the day. In their own words, it was just another normal night. There were no ill feelings, no sense of impending doom, just friends making the best of a situation. Little could the 9 fathom that this would be their last night alive. Chapter 3, Discovery of Tragedy. When the hikers failed to return at their scheduled time, their families and loved ones quickly began to grow anxious. but the authorities just put it down to a normal delay. Such delays in schedules was just a fact when it came to expeditions into the Siberian wilderness. Days turned into weeks before a proper search was mounted for Dyatlov and his group. The longer there was no sign of them, anxiety gave way to utter dread. It wasn't until February 20th that a proper search was mounted for the party. Volunteers, students from the university, and eventually the military began to scour the wilds. They were desperately trying to find any signs of the missing nine. The mountain, however, was still silent, fiercely protective of its secrets. For days, there were no signs of the nine. It was like the mountains themselves had erased the group, and all signs of their passing. For 6 days, they searched, and on February 26th, they finally stumbled upon the camp. Or maybe the better term is the remains of the camp. Chapter 4, The Deepening Mystery. And here is where most of these kinds of stories would begin to wrap up. They would tell the discovery of the scene and offer some kind of explanation as to what happened. The discovery would help tell the end of the story and give everyone some bittersweet closure. That is not the case here. Whereas most times the camp would provide the answers, what searchers stumbled upon that day would in fact only bring forth more questions. The tent, the one-time sanctuary for the adventurers, lay half buried in the snow, one torn sail flapping in the Arctic wind. Further discoveries only fueled the mystery of just what happened here on this rocky slope. The tent was not just buried in the snow, it was slashed from the inside out. That was what had torn the sail free, the sail that now danced in the wind, adding ambience to what had already been a haunting scene. Inside the tent was the party's gear, coats, boots, food all left behind. Also discovered were the diaries of the travelers, and perhaps the most valuable things of all, maps. Everything the group would have needed to survive in the brutal Siberian night was abandoned. And it looked like it had been abandoned in a moment of pure panic and terror. Leading from the camp into the nearby woods were footprints, the only trace of the 9 hikers. Only most of them didn't make sense, given the environment. Some of the footprints were barefoot. Others were clearly imprints of socks, and still yet, some had only one boot on. Following these tracks would lead them to the first tragic discovery. 2 bodies were lying just inside the tree line. They found the remains of Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. The pair were barefoot and clad only in their undergarments. Their hands were torn and bloody. It looked as if they had tried desperately to claw their way up the tree. Whether that was to escape some kind of threat or to try to get a vantage point to find their friends is absolutely anyone else's guess. Nearby, there were the smoldering remains of a campfire. The pair had desperately tried to combat the unrelenting and uncaring Siberian cold in their final hours. Despite their efforts, they would have felt that merciless cold creeping in, like a blanket of inevitability. This was just the beginning of the grim discoveries. Not far from the Yuris, the bodies of Igor Dyatlov, Zina, and Rustem Slobodin were found. Based on the position of the bodies and the footprints in the area, it looked as if the 3 were hiking back up to the tent. The trio was dressed more warmly than the Yuris, but nowhere near enough to withstand a beyond frigid night in Siberia. Dyatlov was found on his back, staring up at the sky. Somehow, even in death, his features seemed to convey a kind of defiance, even as he met his end. Zina, not far from him, was found on her stomach with her head turned towards the tent she was fighting so desperately to return to. While there were very interesting things about these bodies, such as the fact that Dyatlov had significantly more layers than the Yuris, and even had one of his boots on, Some of the most interesting things come from the injuries located on his hands, arms, and face. One of his frozen hands gripped a branch, but the abrasions found on both of his hands suggested he had been in a struggle with the very environment around him as he fought to return to the relative safety of the tent. Zina had even more clothes on than Dyatlov and was a strong indication that she and the other two found with her had scavenged articles of clothing from their fallen comrades. Perhaps it was due to this that she had made it just a little bit further up the hill, her eyes trained toward the tent that she would never reach. She also had a series of abrasions on her hands and face, as well as a long bruise along her side. Rustam, who was found between Zina and Dyatlov, had some of the most interesting injuries of all. Not only was there blood around his nose and mouth, but Rustam also had a 17-centimeter fracture along his skull. While this was most certainly a very serious injury, it was not the immediate cause of his death. All three of the returning group have their cause of death listed as hypothermia. 5 of the group had been retrieved, but the mountain still refused to share all of its secrets. 4 of the young hikers still lay somewhere in the wilderness with only nature as witness to their fate. It would be another 2 months before the final 4 were discovered. While people dared to hope that maybe their discovery would yield profound answers to the many pressing questions, their hope was quashed completely. In fact, it made the already troubling questions that much more disturbing. In the intervening months, Kolatsyakal had tried to erase and bury the evidence of its sin. It had dumped layers of snow on the ravine below the cedar, the last 4 hikers gradually entombed by more layers of silence and secrets. When the May thaw came, another group of searchers set out to once more scale the ageless slope of Kolatsyakal, in another desperate quest to find the missing students. It was in that ravine, half buried in the shallow stream bed, that the bodies of Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thebobrino, and Semyon Zolotaryov would at last be discovered. Chapter 5, The Mysterious and Disturbing Aftermath. The final 4 hikers would not answer any questions. Instead, they only stirred up darker ones. Nikolai had severe and catastrophic injuries. These included a fractured skull, of a magnitude that would only be expected from car wrecks or a very serious fall. Lyudmila's ribs were broken, with her chest caved inward. Her tongue was also missing. Semyon showed the same kind of severe trauma to his chest, but Alexander showed strange deformities around his neck. You would think that there would also be other gruesome signs to support the state of their bodies, bruises, for example, but there were no external injuries, no sign of a struggle with, say, an apex predator. It was as if some invisible force had bypassed their flesh and inflicted fatal trauma internally. Once the last 4 were brought down from their frigid tomb of compacted snow, a whole new kind of investigation began in earnest. In Sverdlovsk, a team of investigators converged. Military men as well as scientists began to pore over every shred of evidence recovered from the Mountain of Death. But once they actually began to investigate, it could probably be called a disturbing lack of evidence. Everything they did have to analyze in no way supported the condition of the final 4 bodies. The remains of the young adventurers told a vastly different story than the physical evidence around them. And there was still no indication of what had sent the 9 hikers fleeing from their tent in the night. And while the mountain loomed over them, almost in silent mockery, they continued to look for answers. Chapter 6, The Theories. Now, it's time to get into everyone, including myself's, favorite part. The theories, the speculations, and the musings. Of theories, there is no shortage, and a lot of them carried an air of authority. Or as much authority as a Soviet-era publicized theory/explanation could carry. A lot of them, on paper or at face value, sounded great. Completely rational and intelligent. That is, until you levied scrutiny at them. Such as the avalanche theory and its debunking. One of the popular early theories was that of an avalanche. To be fair, it was both the most obvious culprit and it was the simplest explanation. But it was also one of the first theories to collapse under its own contradictions. The first one to protest this theory was the very mountain itself. But even if its protests felt less like it was trying to absolve itself of guilt, and more like a mocking, yeah, that's not how I did it kind of vibe. The very terrain itself disproved this theory, as it was less than a 30-degree incline. This fact made it very unlikely, if not impossible, for tons of packed snow and ice to come racing down at cataclysmic speeds. Despite these facts, it was certainly a difficult theory to let go of. It provided some very satisfactory answers to some of the most puzzling questions, such as why did they flee the tent in such a panic? Well, if tons of snow had come barreling down the slope and began to bury the tent, it would stand to reason that they would have cut their way out and fled in whatever state of dress they were in. It would also explain some of the more severe injuries suffered by the hikers. But as we have long established, there is nothing about this case that is simple. If any of this were true, then it is extremely improbable that the tent would have been standing at all. And it was half upright. The bodies of Dyatlov, Zina, Rustem, and the Yuris would have shown more injuries consistent with their friends at the bottom of the ravine. It's also very unlikely they would have been found anywhere but at the bottom of the ravine. But Zina, Dyatlov, and Rustem had been found mere yards from the half-upright tent. Then there's the hurricane or katabatic wind theory and its debunking. Continuing the trend of the environment as antagonist theme, another theory put forth was that of hurricane force winds having swept down from the peak and shredding the tent and sending the party into a panicked escape. Again, this theory answers, quite neatly, the questions of why did they leave the tent, and even takes a stab at explaining the shredded state of the tent. But once more, the mountain itself taunts us by again saying, nope, it's not that either. If it were true that a hurricane raged down the side of the mountains, then some of the most vital clues that we have, the footprints in the snow, would not have been visible. They would have been filled by the untold amount of snow that would have been churned up by the gale force winds. The trees themselves would have to have been miraculously undisturbed by such a phenomenal natural disaster as well. Then there's the criminal or escaped prisoner theory, and how it was debunked. Unable to find any more accusations to the level of the mountain itself, investigators moved on to a possibly more human explanation. Theories began to circulate that escaped prisoners from a gulag might have been involved. It was also speculated that they may have encountered poachers, or even Soviet army units that wanted no witness. And while the idea that 9 young people were chased and hunted through the wilderness is both terrifying and compelling, it's also extremely unlikely. The only visible tracks in the snow were those belonging to the hikers themselves. And again, there was the lack of any solid injuries that could imply they were murdered to compound the lack of evidence that they were pursued. Now, I'm sure that our clever audience has picked up on the fact that we are scaling the slippery slope of escalation. And, much like the slopes of Kolatscheko, the higher we get, the more treacherous each step becomes, and the less sense it makes that we have scaled so high. With the lack of rational, official answers, it was only a matter of time before the court of public opinion began its endless speculation and tale-telling. still searching for some kind of scapegoat for blame to land upon, and a lack of evidence that evil escaped Gulag prisoners or even poachers had been the cause of Dyatlov and his party's demise, more xenophobic voices began to weave tales that held the Mansi people responsible. Before we slide into the theories around them, I want to set up some context, as I'm wont to do. The Mansi people are a tribal people that have made their home in the Ural Mountains for generations. Even the name of the mountain, Kolatshekl, comes from them, and it means Mountain of the Dead in their native tongue. They have a timeless kind of existence and dwell in that murky realm where myth and history are completely impossible to untangle from each other. So, we have the theory of the Mansi revenge theory. With the only witness to what truly happened, Kolatshekl itself, not talking, and no satisfying explanations forthcoming, it was only natural for things to begin drifting into a more fantastical realm of speculation. And of course, fear of the unknown led to a misunderstanding that ended up with hate becoming the scapegoat. Soviet investigators quickly noted that Dyatlov's marked trail cut right through Mansi hunting grounds, and this led to multiple Mansi hunters being detained for what was, quote, gentle questioning, I'm sure. For the bureaucracy, it was just another inquiry, but for the Mansi, it was the syndicated performance that played out every time they or other ancient tribal people like them are called on to answer questions and offer explanations for things that wider society fails to understand. And once more, they fell victim to fear and ignorance. The always infallible logic suggested that Dyatlov and his party had trespassed or otherwise disturbed sacred ground. Perhaps they had angered the spirits. Maybe they had agitated the slumbering mountain itself. To the Mansi, the mountain had long been a place of dread, symbolized in the very name they gave it, the Mountain of the Dead. To us, when we hear Kolatshekl, we hear a mysterious and exotic name. The Mansi hear a description of an all too real and terrifying force of nature. What had become a running unsolved mystery began to become a legend. The curse of a place that was already ancient when human eyes first beheld it, and the people who were viewed as its stewards carried the blame. But, as with the escaped prisoner or criminal theory, short of there being any actual supernatural forces at play that completely erased just the signs of Mansi hunters taking the lives of the 9 young hikers, there's no physical evidence of any human involvement in their deaths. Chapter 7, The Weird Ones. Now, I told you that we were scaling to the peak of escalation, and here we are, my friends, at the peak. I wanted to do these kind of on their own because a lot of these are way beyond the pale, and honestly, that's what makes them such great stories, but strap in because, well, these theories are going to get weird. The UFO/orange ball theory. In the aftermath of the bodies being discovered, witnesses from the surrounding villages began coming forward with stories of seeing orbs of light floating over the mountain during the nights when the hikers vanished. Even the Soviet military logs of the time mentioned seeing the fireballs, and from there, fear and the imagination did the rest, and the stories wrote themselves in the imagination. In this version of the story, it's speculated that the hikers saw the orbs and tried to photograph them, or otherwise ended up having some kind of bizarre otherworldly encounter. What seemed to lend credence to this version of the events was the presence of irradiated clothing found on some of the hikers in Dyatlov's party. Of course, these versions also fail to mention that 2 of the hikers, those being Alexander and Yuri, worked in a lab that handled irradiated material, and being 1959, the chances these materials were handled with precautions that would be in place, even in, say, the 80s, is very unlikely. But of course, the presence of radiation on the clothing of the hikers became the, quote, proof of alien technology being involved. Then we have the snow beast, or Yeti, theory. Now, this one is probably that's Tom's, favorite, just because it is so absolutely fantastical that it just makes a damn good story. And we all know that I love a damn good story. This one was spawned because of one little photograph. The photo itself isn't particularly memorable or special, and yet because of one tiny detail, an entire subgenre of theories and stories about what happened to Dyatlov and his party emerged. In the corner of the picture, in the distance, is a single blurred and shadowy silhouette. And of course, this blurry, quote, photo evidence could only mean one thing. Well, one of three things, possibly. The first, of course, being Bigfoot. Except Bigfoot doesn't like the cold that much. The second would be more plausible, I suppose, and that being the Yeti. And I do say more plausible here quite loosely, but at least geographically it sounds better. More plausible. And thirdly, well, if Tennessee has its wild men, then so do the Urals. Out of these three, I guess, pick your favorite. Then there is the infrasound panic theory. This one was saved for last because it is the multiracial love child of science and derangement. I know the two aren't mutually exclusive, but when they pair up so wonderfully, it's a thing of beauty. So far, we have stories that have blamed Kolatchiakal itself, stories that blame the Red Army, even ones that blame snow beasts and aliens. So now we get to talk about wind. In the 2010s, a theory began to circulate that the very wind itself, blowing in a rare pattern down the mountain pass, created low-frequency vibrations that triggered an irrational panic in the hikers and sent them fleeing into the night. Sounds plausible. Yes, there's that word again. The big issue with this story, again, comes from the very mountain itself. The geography of the mountain pass doesn't support the kind of wind funnel that would be needed to actually create such a frequency. That doesn't seem to deter people from attributing such an event to the demise of 9 young people in 1959, though. And finally, we move forward to Chapter 8, the new evidence. Now we get into something a bit more recent, and it kind of circles back to our first theory, the avalanche theory. And I know that you're thinking the same thing I am. I told you that the avalanche theory had been debunked, and now I'm telling you that the recent findings lend a kind of credence to it. So I'm going to clear the air a little bit here and say that the original classic avalanche theory has been debunked. But in 1959, they probably only thought there was one kind of avalanche. The kind that altered landscapes in its wake. Thousands and thousands of pounds of snow rumbling down a mountain slope. Rolling thunder with a much deadlier surprise than a lightning strike. But, with sophistications in our understandings of nature, technological advancements, and a natural curiosity that lingers about this particular legend. After all, that Soviet-era secrecy, denials, and unwillingness to continue chasing what seemed to be an endless parade of dead ends, forgive the phrasing. In 2019, a mere 6 years ago, the Russian authorities reopened the Dyatlov Pass case. And, thanks to the most unlikely of sources, came up with a brilliant theory. Now, that source, of all things, is the movie Frozen. Using the same kind of algorithm that Disney used to simulate the way hard-packed snow would move. When applied to the Dyatlov Pass incident, it showed that it was entirely possible that a more localized event, known as a slab avalanche, could have occurred. The really twisted part is that the avalanche was likely triggered by the hikers when they pitched their camp for the night. As such a slab of hard, heavy, compacted snow became dislodged and partially buried the tent. From there, it is likely that the hikers fled the tent with whatever they had on, possibly trying to pull on extra layers as they fled. When the slab avalanche occurred, they probably assumed it was a much larger event, and, as such, fled into the relative safety of the cedar and probably further down into the ravine. I know this still has a lot of speculation backed up by circumstantial evidence, and I know there are still a lot of questions. But sadly, they're ones that we will probably never have answers to. It's just the kind of mystery that will always keep the legend of the Dyatlov Pass incident and the 9 young hikers who lost their lives on that tragic night in February of 1959. And of course, as we do, we have to close this out by honoring the 9 people that lost their lives. Igor Dyatlov, 23, Zenaida Kalmogorova, 22, Lyudmila Dubanina, 20, Rustem Slobodin, 23, Yuri Krivonishenko, 23, Yuri Doroshenko, 21, Alexander Kolovatov, 24, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, 24, and Semyon Alexander Zolotyov, 38. May they all rest in peace. I am compelled to begin this, that's Tom saying this, by saying that this was not the script I had planned on writing at all. So, with a little transparency, as this channel is known for, I spent 3 days researching and writing a script, using a couple different sites, and when it was run through for an editing pass and quick analysis, GPT told Tom that it was a very plausible piece of fiction. Well, this is dark history and not dark made-up conspiracy BS. I do want to mention, outside of his script, he actually told me about something he was researching, and all about what happened here, and, it's unfortunate. He had a great idea, did a lot of research on it from one main source and a second main source, I believe, only to find out that it was, not something that really happened, so there's that. Anyways. And beyond dark urban legends and other more supernatural kinds of scripts or old myths about places and creatures, I will never knowingly present you with a completely made-up thing. I appreciate that. I'm here to entertain and inform, and passing off made-up stuff is not the way to build trust in our dark history experiments. True. So, the case that I do have is firmly rooted in the Cold War. It is a completely verified case, and I promise that it will be deeply creepy and unsettling. I'll also give everyone a trigger warning here, as it does get pretty dark, and we will of course hold back some of the more gruesome details, but it's just to say enough that you can extrapolate things for yourself. And thank you everyone for listening, and much love to each and every single one of you. Chapter 1. Re-education and Unmasking. Gheorghe Kauchu stood in the courtyard of the prison. He was surrounded by both inmates and guards, and none of them had friendly looks in their eyes, despite the fact that he knew many of his fellow inmates quite well. In this moment, nothing in their past mattered. What he was about to endure was something that no human being should ever have to endure. With a cold order, the guards demanded that Kauchu be unmasked. When the beating began, it wasn't the guards inflicting the brutality with their own hands. It was his fellow prisoners. It didn't necessarily start as a beating. It started with barbed, venomous questions. Who are you loyal to? What god are you loyal to? What party are you loyal to? Every answer earned another blow. Every hesitation, another. If Kauchu fell to his knees, they would force him back to his feet, and the unmasking, demascare, would continue. They would demand that he forsake his family, that he blaspheme, that he renounce his god. He was commanded under violence to swear his eternal allegiance to the Communist Party. The truly terrifying part of this entire scenario is that it wasn't a spontaneous act of violence orchestrated by a savage guard solely for the purpose of correcting Gheorghe. Kauchu was not the first, nor was he the last, to receive this kind of torment. In fact, the entire thing was institutional violence. It was just the modus operandi of the Pitesti prison. Each beating, every act of torture was systemic. demanded and expected of the people who operated the prison for the Securitate. And in 1950, this would not even have been Cauchu's first experience with this kind of treatment. By the time the one I just described had happened, Cauchu had already been incarcerated for 2 years. He was arrested in 1948 and sentenced to hard labor. He was bounced around a few different prisons until he landed in Pitesti. When he arrived, he probably had no idea about the whole re-education theme that Pitesti revolved around. Chapter 2. The Architects. As with all great systemic tragedies in history, the question invariably arises: who done it? And I have to say that there is no clear single person that we know of that started the entire thing. We do know the person most likely that did it, and the person that approved of it becoming policy. That would be one General Alexandru Nikolsky, born as Boris Grunberg. I would have changed my name too. Nikolsky was born in Balti, which was then part of Romania and now Moldova. He was Soviet-trained and entered Romania with the Red Army in 1944, and in 1948 he helped found the infamous Securitate, an organization on par with the, let's say, Gestapo, or its successor counterpart, the Stasi. Nikolsky was also the Deputy Minister of the Interior. It's believed that he may have approved of, if not encouraged, the entire policy of re-education. With his position, which he held from 1948 until 1953, he was probably one of the top 3, if not the second most powerful man in Romania's internal security structure. He was the overseer of the labor camps, the prisons, and most importantly, the Securitate. With his authority over the Directorate of Prisons, it's believed by historians that the entire program could not have moved forward without his approval. And while there's no signed document by him approving or even implementing the order, his office appears repeatedly in correspondence and testimony that frame the entire operation. And while he, of course, never wanted any finger pointing at him, implementation of this entire program fell to the warden of Pitesti, Alexandru Dumitrescu. He became the warden in late 1949, and is quoted to have said, "The re-education must succeed. Use the student Turcanu." Dumitrescu even went so far as giving Turcanu and his group of thugs access to every cell block. He also removed all the normal guards and allowed the prisoners to discipline each other. In the aftermath, Dumitrescu, during the 1954 trials, followed the classic, quote, "I was just following orders from the ministry" play. He claimed that he had no knowledge of any torture. The court, however, didn't buy into his excuses, and he was sentenced to life in prison, although that was later commuted. This then brings us to Chapter 3, The Enforcer. Now, we are going to talk about possibly the most terrifying man of all. Not the person that approved it, not the architect that made it possible, but the man that actively enforced the policy. Eugen Turcanu. Now, we're going to take a moment to look at young Eugen, because his past is quite interesting indeed, and provides us with the answers as to why they chose him to lead the re-education of other inmates. Eugen was born in 1925, and as a teenager joined the Romanian homegrown fascist movement, the Iron Guard. After the end of World War II, he tried to save his own hide by joining the Communist Party for a short time. It didn't work out for him. In 1948, his past nationalist associations would catch up with him when the new communist regime swept up an entire generation of university students that had shown past nationalist or fascist sympathies. So, it was at this time that Turcanu found himself condemned for conspiracy against the social order. Thus, young Turcanu found himself at Suceava prison. He quickly learned that either you committed the violence or were a victim of the violence. That being said, he approached the prison authorities and volunteered to enforce the re-education program for them. Now, it's very important to note that Suceava was one of the first prisons to implement the Reeducare prin munca si disciplina, and if I missaid that, I apologize. Or in English, re-education through labor and discipline. They implemented this against many students that were rounded up in what amounted to, well, nothing less than a purge of academia. And he approached his duties so enthusiastically that in late 1949, he moved from Suceava to Pitesti in order to, quote, continue his work. Chapter 4: The Reign of Terror. The prison was already full of tension and, of course, a general kind of unrest when Turcanu arrived in late 1949. Most of the inmates were university students, but also seminarians and even some former soldiers. In short, most of them were educated, devout, and just the kind of people the party would want to re-educate. And if you've not caught on yet, re-educate is a sort of euphemism for torture. The system he found in place for the entire campaign was hardly what he would turn it into. The entire system existed largely just on paper, with little real control over the inmates or their so-called re-education. It was mostly limited to some ideological lectures and a little bit of forced labor. Turcanu was going to change that entirely. He was just the only one who knew it at this point. He wasted no time forming his squad. Inmates that either shared his sadistic tendencies and/or men that were desperate to avoid the usual barbarism that occurs within most prison environments. This band of ne'er-do-wells, they called themselves the Organizacja, or the Organization. Perhaps owing to the clout he brought with him from Suceava under the warden Dumitrescu, Turcanu and his band of miscreants were given the license to freely travel between the other cell blocks. The guards always looked the other way, probably under orders from the warden. Some of the guards would bring certain, quote, disorderly prisoners to the squad for sessions. Chapter 5: The Sessions. Now, unfortunately, we have to talk about just what went on when Turcanu took over enforcement of the re-education program inside Pitesti. Just what did these sessions mean for the people who experienced them? Well, nothing good, I can promise you that. We already got a taste for the unmasking through the eyes of a man that survived Pitesti. But that was only stage 2 of the process. First came the ideological unmasking. This was the psychological unmasking of a prisoner. First, they would be forced to sit or kneel in front of Turcanu and his barbarian tribe. First came the reading of charges that amounted to no less than paranoid accusations, such as hidden bourgeois sympathies, secret prayers at night, or loyalty to a priest. Then came the interrogations. The process began with a chilling question for which there was no right answer. Cine este tu? Or, who are you? The goal of the entire ideological unmasking wasn't getting a confession. It was about unmaking everything about who the person in the hot seat thought they were. Stripping down mental identity until they were a hollowed-out shell of who they once were. But for the ones that tried to defend their ideals, their friends, their family, their faith, well, that was when things got dialed up even further. Should you not break during the ideological unmasking, then you went to the next logical escalation, the physical unmasking. This is where the accused is beaten by fellow inmates until he parrots whatever it is that Turcanu wants them to say. And the, let's call them methods of persuasion, that Turcanu favored were plentiful and varied. Actual survivors of these sessions said that fists, belts, and even table legs wrapped in towels, just so the skin bruised but didn't bleed too soon, had been used on them until, well, they said whatever they had to in order for the beatings to stop. But that wasn't necessarily the end of the torment for them. There was, as there always is, an escalation of sorts. but not the way that you might think. No, instead, it was what you might call ritualized moral corruption. The prisoners that went through the physical unmaskings were then forced to inflict that same kind of violence upon their brothers in chains. We became both victim and executioner, one of the survivors later wrote. Chapter 4, Cover-Up. By 1951, it could be said that Turcanu had become the victim of his own success. The network of cruelty had spread beyond the walls of Pitesti by this point, and other prisoners were adopting the unmasking doctrine. However, as I said, that success was rapidly coming around to bite Turcanu in the most satisfying of ways. By this point, the cruelty wasn't just something that inmates whispered about amongst themselves. No, now it was a real problem that the bureaucrats in Bucharest were trying to figure out how to deal with. The euphemistic phrase, progress in ideological rehabilitation, was no longer being bought by the people in power. By this time, the stories were seeping out in droves as doctors transferred inmates, and even guards themselves began to, well, do what people do. Talk. It was at this point even the most devout, see what I did there, of party men began to realize that things had gone incredibly wrong. The first real tremors came when the word that Turcanu and his organization had been sent to other prisons, Gerlu, Targu, Akna, among others, to replicate the experiment and implement the same kind of system at these locations. The real problem lay in the fact that without Turcanu being the one fully in control, the proceedings, as they say, became chaotic, impossible to keep off the radar of others. Bigger sharks in the communist sea. The wardens of these prisons began sending anxious messages back to the Securitate, asking repeatedly for clarification on re-education procedures. By now, the blip on Bucharest's radar was growing. Hell, by now it was less a blip and more of a raging dumpster fire with a marching band sporting red flags advertising everything that had gone wrong with their notion of ideological rehabilitation for the entire world to see. So in mid-1951, when officials from Bucharest, including members of the Securitate as well as the party Central Committee, finally came calling, what they found was, for such refined men of order, it's us being facetious, absolutely mind-boggling. It wasn't even the maimed prisoners, the completely destroyed cells, or even the general anarchy of the prisoners inflicting violence on each other that truly shook these men. It was the fact that the violence had become so theatrical and over the top that it was now visible for every citizen of Romania and beyond to see. That dumpster fire was catching the attention on a global scale. Thus, in the wake of these impeccably timed inspections, the re-education program was suspended. Turcanu and several of his cohorts were shipped away to Hilava prison for interrogations. All of the documents surrounding Pitesti were subsequently sealed and/or destroyed. The warden, Dumitrescu, was reassigned pending investigation, which I'm assuming means that penguins became a large part of his job description for whatever remained of his once illustrious career. By 1952, the party had buried, reassigned, burned, extorted, or otherwise, quote, dealt with every document and person that could possibly point the finger at their involvement with the entire ideological rehabilitation program, and proven that it was anything but the benevolent institution they claimed it to be. The entire narrative, of course, ended with Turcanu and his miscreants being the scapegoat for what was nothing less than an entire system of state-sponsored terror and torture. Labeling Turcanu as a bad actor, or more precisely, quote, an agent of foreign fascist influence, everything looked quite squeaky clean as far as the party was concerned. Well, except for 31 loose ends and problems currently taking up space in the Hilava prison. In 1954, the Securitate and the party moved to singe off those frayed ends in true old-school Soviet fashion. They put Turkanu and 30 of his collaborators on trial. Most of Turkanu's men were found guilty and were either executed or sentenced to draconian prison sentences. Turkanu himself was found guilty and executed by firing squad in December of that same year. Sadly, I was mistaken about Dumitrescu. While I had hoped his job description would put him somewhere on an ice cube just north of absolutely nowhere and south of no one will ever find you, he was put on trial. He was sentenced to life, and he had his sentence commuted and walked free and clear within a few short years. Nikolsky, the absolute waste of life that through either his active support for or callous indifference to human suffering made this entire horror show possible, was never charged, jailed, not even fined for his part in the atrocity. No, that old bastard lived comfortably into retirement, a decorated party man, until his death in 1992. And I think that's something that's important to consider. This wasn't that long ago. I, Raven, was born in 1991. This man died 1 year after I was born. That gap isn't that wide. And for some closing thoughts, I just kind of wanted to put a bow on this somehow. I think that stories like these, while disturbing and incredibly dark, should be told. They need and deserve to be told, and they deserve to be listened to. Because when we forget that things like this happened, it only makes it easier for it to happen again and again. And things like this should never happen again. Much love, my friends. I'm going to leave you all with the words of the man who we looked through the eyes of at the beginning. One of the survivors of Pitesti, Gheorghe Cauciu. They tried to turn a man into a beast. And the miracle is that some came out as saints. From the frozen, silent slopes of the Mountain of Death to the chaotic violence of a Romanian prison cell, these stories force us to confront the fragility of our existence. The Dyatlov Pass remains one of history's great enigmas, a snapshot of 9 young lives cut short by a force that we still struggle to fully understand. But the horror of Pitesti is undeniably human. It serves as a grim reminder of how political ideology can be twisted into a weapon designed to turn men into beasts. We explore these dark chapters not to revel in fear, but to remember those who were lost to it. So, which of these accounts did you find more disturbing? And do you believe the theories that are associated with them? Let us know your comments down below, of course. If you appreciated us shining a light on these dark histories, if you will, and you're on YouTube, please do leave a like on the video, and subscribe if you're new to the channel and like what you heard. If you're on Spotify, leave me a comment down below, and let me know your thoughts. And anywhere else you can follow the podcast if you so choose, I would appreciate it, but also never expect it. And if you have any recommendations for another scary mystery that we could potentially shine some light on, let me know. Please. Tom and I are happy to do these. And this is something new, obviously, that we're doing for the podcast. Obviously, I do want to say a huge shout out and thank you to Tom K., the man who helps me with my research episodes, research stories that I sometimes include in other episodes. And when I say helps, I mean he does the heavy lifting, because he really does. So thank you, Tom. Please, everyone, do let Tom know that he's an amazing dude and that we appreciate him a lot. So, yeah. All that said, friends, I hope you have a beautiful week. Hope I see you again here very soon. But until then, remember you are loved, valid, and important, and you're the best that you can be. Don't forget it. Until next time, much love, and sleep well.